3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve and Chava. 3631, 137, son of Adam was born. 3526, 235, Enosh, son of Seth was born. 3436, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh was born. 3366, 395, Mahalal, son of Kenan was born. Coffee and Kabbalah blowing coffee. Regretted now, Hamlet on the Shekhet Shanabum Mitzvah Fitzvana Asifra Omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 29 days, which is 4 weeks and 1 day of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily, and our days on Salah.
magical spells would empower those code words, and those code words would. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. All right, folks. Well, welcome back to this sort of traveling, let's call it a circus. 3-ring, 5-ring circus, I don't know. 5-ring circus, that's pretty cool. Let's get back into this, and let's start by just, again, as we try to do every time, let's just recap a little bit so we're on the same page. And that page, of course, here on the left is a picture from Sefer Razi Hamalach, one of the most famous books of Jewish magic ever written. You're seeing two different kamayot. These are amulets for various kinds of things written in angelic language. So if you ever want to know what the language of the angels looks like, those are two examples of angelic language being written out there. Now, what they say, I have no idea. You have to ask the angels. I don't know, write Michael at olamhabad.gov, and maybe he'll write you back. Doesn't seem to write me back. What we noticed last time about Jewish magic, and we did sort of a big romp through Jewish magic, is that Judaism and magic have had a very complicated, very long relationship. And I say very long relationship because, as I pointed out last time, the earliest document we have of the Torah is a magical amulet recovered from Jerusalem and the Kityat tombs there, and written on silver. You can see it in the Israel Museum. So the very first documents we have of the Bible are magical amulets, probably. So if you want to say that Jews don't do magic, well, they must not do Torah too. So it's a non-starter. So they've had this very complicated, very tortured history of magic, where on the one hand, it's very clear that the Bible and the people that wrote the Hebrew Bible have a very uncomfortable relationship with magical practices for lots of reasons, theological reasons obviously included here, right? The idea that you can affect supernatural causation. If you can affect supernatural causation, then who needs a God? It kind of makes God redundant, right? God becomes like a thing that you really don't need. If you can like make it rain, you can make yourself fall in love with people, or make people fall in love with you, or make pennies from heaven. Who needs a God when they can win the lottery on their own through magic? And at the same time, right, we see that Jewish magic has persisted all through the centuries. We see it again all the way back to Kitab Nom and all the way down through now. And as I pointed out, right, when I say all the way down through now, my bottom point really obtains here. In the Haredi community, in the community of ultra-Orthodox Jews, we see magical manuals still being published to this day. And also, of course, in the liberal Jewish world, there's an entire world of practicing Jewish witches. And other folks who identify as Kohenites, who are also very interested in things like astrology and magical practices. And so we see that the Jewish magic has really thrived down through the ages, and unsurprisingly, it's mirrored local magical traditions. So we see that Jewish magic often looks a lot like the magic of the area that they're living in. So we see the same kinds of magic in the Greco-Egyptian period. We see Jewish magic being practiced in the Babylonian context with those cool incantation bowls. And then as we move through the Roman period and in the European period, we're going to see that Jewish magic will often borrow from the local cultures, but also influence those cultures as well. And that will be especially true in the European context, where Jewish magic has had a disproportionate impact on the development of European magic. That's why if you ever see those magical squares, most books of magic, European non-Jewish books of magic, there's some Hebrew there, right? Well, it's not because they like Jews. They were perfectly happy to see Jews sent to whatever dreadful fate they were sent to. But they did admit that Jews had secret powers, magical powers, and they were perfectly happy to use them. As we saw, Jewish magic ran the gamut, right? It ran the gamut from curses, because everybody gets salty, right? And cursing people's like your thing, right? Divination, who doesn't want to know the future? Love magic, because who wants to go to sleep alone? But again, you should be careful, right? Love magic. Consent is a value we have around here, and of course, love magic isn't about consent. We have grimoires, which are medieval Jewish spell books that contain a wide range of Jewish magical experiments. In fact, in medieval times, Al, you'll appreciate this, that the word experiment actually derives itself from the medieval Latin word for experimenta, which were magical spells. So the word experiment actually has its origin in the technical word for a magical operation. And the word experiment actually comes from that. So if you look at medieval magical manuals, they'll say an experiment for invisibility. And what's interesting, right, is that those invisibility spells would be tinkered with to try to make them work better or work at all. And so when modern science, the so-called new science, came along, they just adopted that language. And so it's interesting to see that, again, the boundary between magic and science early on is pretty vague sometimes. So we also see amulets, right? Amulets are devices used to call various kinds of, either to receive positive energy, perhaps from the stars, stellar influence, or repulse bad energy in the form of things like demons, shadim. So we see amulets. Astrological magic was also very popular. Sefer Razio Hamala, the book you're looking at now on the screen, was a big part of ancient astrological magic. We have demon capturing bowls. We have the creation of living beings. We'll talk a lot about that tonight as we get into the Sefer Yetzirah. The golem is probably the Jewish monster par excellence. I imagine most folks here have heard of the golem. Of course, that myth comes from the Sefer Yetzirah, which we'll talk about this evening at length. Of course, we also have angel summoning and the whole thing. So Jewish magic really ran the gamut. So again, what I really want to drive home about the process of Jewish magic is what I said last time, is that people who want to tell you that magic isn't Jewish and there's no such thing as Jewish magic, well, they got some archaeology to talk to. Right, that's my basic argument. You can say that this is not a thing and that's not a thing. You can say it's not acceptable in your community, fine. But to tell me that Jews didn't do it for 3,000 years, you're just badly informed. I don't know what else to tell you. The scientific archaeological paleographic data tells me that you're wrong, And if you want to just sort of put your fingers in the air and go, la, 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 Jews didn't do this, well, have fun being wrong, because it's very good that Jews did. So, now, again, whether your community accepts it, whether you go to Oak Park over there and whether they are okay with it, or Borough Park, or you go to Crown Heights and see if they practice magic, I don't know. But probably, again, but nothing down the street. He's up 12 in the middle of the night doing some weird stuff. He might be up to some magic, right? And he wouldn't be that weird. And if you think about this from a historical perspective, but the fact that there are magicians, sorcerers operating in Jewish communities all over the world through history, any community that doesn't have one is probably the weirdo community. That's probably the weirdo community. The one that doesn't have one, right? The much more likely outcome is they do. So Jewish magic has been here. It will be here. It's not going to go away. And by the way, this is true of magic in general. Magic is more popular now than ever before. All right. So for better or worse, it's here. So tonight, we're going to do it, folks. We're going to get into the very first vestiges, the very first layer stratum of the Kabbalah. So we're going to do it. We're talking about this distinction between Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. We're not going to hit that. We're going to begin to get into the world of Kabbalah. But to do that, we have to introduce things a little bit from a philosophical angle. And that's because while people often think of Kabbalah as a kind of mysticism, and people think of mysticism as somehow opposed to science or opposed to philosophy, those kinds of oppositions just did not exist in the late classical world, and they certainly didn't exist in the Middle Ages. So we have to loosen up our categories a little bit here, right? Because we often think of these things existing in opposites, right? Science doesn't like mysticism doesn't like philosophy and science can't really get along. And so they're all fighting, and this is the way this is our world, right? It's not theirs. Their world is a much different world than ours. And the first thing you have to do is kind of, take your modernity hat off and put a different hat on, whatever that hat is, a wig or whatever. And so we have to understand that in the late classical world, the relationship between philosophy, mysticism, magic, religion was very complicated and very mixed together, right? So drawing a line between one of these and the other of these is just really not possible. And so what we have to understand is that Judaism has always had a very weird relationship with the outside world. Always very weird relationship, right? Because on the one hand, Jews want to maintain their cultural, religious distinctiveness. And on the other hand, well, the outside world's kind of cool. They got Greek science, and they got like TV, and they got Xbox, and all this stuff, right? So there's all kinds of things about the outside world that Jews want to admit is cool, but yet at the same time, we don't want to use the bad A word. You know what the bad A word is? Assimilate. Assimilate, right? This is the bad A word, right? So there's this idea that Jews do not want to assimilate, but they always have to some degree. And even when they don't, that not assimilation is actually a response to assimilation, right? You're never outside that logic. So deal with the relationship between ancient, late classical Jews and Greek science. Because the Greeks had a lot of stuff figured out, folks. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, whether they were right or not, I don't think they were. The Greek model of the world was a far better model of the world. It explained, at least at some level, why the planets did what they did, right? Greek science, Greek math, right? When you see it, I don't know if folks here have ever done a geometry class, right? But when you prove to yourself that Pythagorean theorem is true, it's magical. It's magical. When you see mathematical proof of something, you're like, damn, that's really true. That's for real true. Not like I made it up, like I had a fever dream about it being true or whatever. That's true. And it can't be otherwise. The Greeks pioneered a lot of this stuff. Now, it's not to say the Greeks invented everything, right? The Pythagorean theorem has been known by the Babylonians in the form of what are called Pythagorean triplets well before Pythagoras, right? And Pythagoras leaned heavily on the Egyptians for a lot of his mathematical knowledge. As you might imagine, the Egyptians knew a thing or two about triangles. So, again, the Greeks had things going on, right? And the Greeks were the big pioneers on what we might now recognize as something like empirical science or theoretical science. Now, what's really important about this is, right, Jews have always had a sort of touch-pull relationship with Greek science. But what increasingly begins to happen is that Jewish philosophy begins to be deeply influenced by two distinct forms of Greek philosophy. Now, these two forms of Greek philosophy, we have names for them now, right? We call them Neo-Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism. Now, I'm going to do a lot more Neoplatonism next time when we get into Kabbalah proper. But tonight, what I really want to focus on is a school of Greek philosophy that we now call Neo-Pythagoreanism. Now, you can imagine how many Greeks called their philosophy Neo-Pythagoreanism. The answer is exactly zero. No Greeks called their school that. Right? Everyone just thought they were being philosophers. But there are two things that are really important about what we now call Neo-Pythagoreanism. Right? And don't be put off by the name. It's just one of these $4 words to make philosophers sound smart. Basically, what we're talking about here is two things. One thing we're talking about here is the influence of Pythagorean philosophy. And Pythagorean philosophy is the same philosophy that many string theorists probably will believe in today, and that is the world is fundamentally mathematical. Right? Not describable in terms of math, but math. The world is mathematical, right? And so that's the main thing, right? That the structure of reality, the fundamental structure of reality is mathematical in nature. Again, this idea probably is more popular now in some forms of contemporary physics than it ever has been. The second thing that's worth noting about this is that for the Neo-Pythagoreans, the union with God was possible. One could be like God, right? God, singular God, right? Because the Pythagoreans are all about like everything going back to one, right? And so they really thought that fundamentally things were fixed. And so the idea was you could be like that too. You could unite your consciousness. You could unite your being. You could unite your nous with the divine. And as you can imagine, those two ideas are part and parcel of a great deal of what becomes mysticism in the ancient world and, of course, in the modern world as well. By the way, what the image you're seeing on the screen here is an image from a Pythagorean or Neo-Pythagorean basilica that was actually this century in Rome. It's recently been reopened. I've always wanted to go there. It's perfectly preserved. This is where Neo-Pythagoreans hung out in Rome. It's basically completely preserved. It was only discovered on accident. And so it's really neat that you can go into these places where these guys were like hanging out, talking about numbers and stuff. And it's actually preserved in Rome. I think they allow a very small amount of people to go in there. So next time I go to Rome, I'm going to try to be one of those very small group of people. So let's combine that, right? Let's think of this idea with some ideas from Judaism. Now, Judaism, as you probably know from the book of Genesis in the Bible, Bereshit, that the way that God makes the world in Jewish lore, in Jewish mythology, in Israelite mythology, is that God speaks the world into being. That the existence is a speech act, right? God says, Yehi or, let there be light, and Vayehi or, there was light. The very act of speech causes being to come into existence. And thus, right, if God speaks Hebrew, which of course Israelites thought, Jews think that God does, that's the language of God. In fact, that's what we call Hebrew Lashon Kodesh, right? Lashon Kodesh, that it is holy language. Then the very reality of Hebrew is that Hebrew itself has magical power. It's the case that the language itself is special. It's metaphysically powerful. It's quasi-divine. Because if God speaks it, then it can't be just a bunch of random sounds, right? We make random sounds, dog, right, or whatever, right? We think of sounds as being random, but God's speech isn't random. God's speech is the opposite of random. It's ordering. Because in the ancient Israelite imagination, remember back from the first talk, that part of what goes on in the ancient Israelite mind worldview is that God is ordering the world out of chaos. For the ancient Israelites, it's chaos versus order. So what does God's speech do? It orders the universe. And this is unsurprising, right? Because grammar, if you've ever studied some grammar, if you've been tortured by some grammar, you know the thing that's torturous about grammar is that it's orderly. And that's what's hard about it. It's about learning the patterns, learning when there's exceptions to patterns, and why there are exceptions to patterns. It's orderly. And so language as an act of order is how God created the world. There was nothing, tohu vohu, chaos, and then God spoke, and it ordered it. So Hebrew has this kind of power. You see this very early on in Israelite, you might call it linguistics or ontology or the metaphysics of language. But there are two ways in which this plays itself out. The first, of course, is that language is magical. This is unsurprising, right? If you imagine a sorcerer, the one thing every child knows about what sorcerers say, right, is abracadabra. Well, you might think that's just nonsense gibberish, but it's not. It's Aramaic. Avara kadabra literally means in Aramaic something like I create as I speak. Now, think about that for a minute, right? Abracadabra, avara kadabra, I create as I speak. Well, if a magician is uttering that, who are they imitating? God. Because God creates the speech. So, on the one hand, we have language is magical. You can do magic with language. We've already seen that with Hebrew being used in all its magical practices. But if you can speak that magical language, it's not just that you can do magical powers. You have magical powers. You're also imitatio Dei, imitating God. You're being as if a god, right? Because God can do it through language. Well, if God speaks that language and you speak that language, you are kind of being quasi-divine. And so, if insofar as one can speak that language and conjure things into being, you can imitate God, but also you can become unified with God. Because in the same way that God creates through speech, you create through speech, you are imitating and being like God. This is the theological equivalent of fake it till you make it. Right, folks? This is you becoming united with God by acting like God. And by acting like God, one becomes unified with God. So you can see how this circuit is being closed, right? And how the role of Hebrew in Israelite theology and the role of Hebrew in the action of doing sort of mystical stuff, right, allows one to engage in this mystically powerful language. The image here to the left that you're seeing is from Abraham Abulafia, founder of the prophetic Kabbalah, who we'll get to in a couple of weeks. These are meditation wheels by which one can, in fact, change one's consciousness by, and by changing one's consciousness, I mean elevate one's consciousness to be unified with God via prophecy by meditating on specific words in the Hebrew alphabet, sort of manuscript of Abraham Abulafia, not written by him, but of one of his texts. We'll get to him in a couple of weeks. The first time we see this idea of imitating God by using language to create things is in the Babylonian Talmud. And this gets back to Al's point, right, where Al commented that on the one hand we have the rabbis and everyone else. Well, here's where I want to disrupt that. Because in the Babylonian Talmud, we have the rabbis doing the exact same, the thing that you said they didn't do, right? You wanted to draw a line, and here's what I'm saying, the line can't be drawn. So we have in the Babylonian Talmud in two different stories, which are probably mirroring each other, but being told by two different rabbis in Tractate Sanhedrin, where we have both Abiah and Rabbah, two very prominent rabbis, discussing death penalty cases, right? So the Tractate Sanhedrin, as you may know from Babylonian Talmud, is all about death penalty cases. And one of the things that is a death penalty case is sorcery, kishuf. You're not allowed to practice sorcery. And so what is constitutive of sorcery, right? So they say there's all kinds of things that are constitutive of sorcery, right? But creating illusions isn't. You're allowed to create illusions. This is the rabbinical idea that you can do stage magic. In fact, kishuf, I think in modern Hebrew, actually indicates stage magic. Right? What is allowed? This is positively mind-boggling. All right, such was formed by Rabbi Fina and Rabbi Shaya, who spent every Shabbos Eve in studying Hilchot Yetzirah. We'll talk about what this is in just a minute. By means of which they created a third-grown calf and ate it. So they studied Hilchot Yetzirah, right? This literally means the doing of the Yetzirah, right? So if you want to have a book about the laws, like Hilchot Shabbat is how to practice Shabbat. It's the laws of Shabbat. Hilchot Yetzirah is the laws of formation. How you make something. Well, what did they do? They studied it, and on the eve of on Erev Shabbos, on the Shabbat Eve, they created a third-grown calf and they ate it for Shabbat. They made a calf. They made one. Rabbah said, this is even more dramatic. Rabbah said that if the righteous desired it, they could create a world. Now, this translation is hiding something. This is a translation from Sefaria, but the actual translation in the Aramaic says they could create a world, just like God. They could create an olam. Now, that is positively mind-blowing. That if you were righteous, you could create a world, right? But you have inequities, so you can't. Now, Rabbah created a man, right, and sent him to Rabbi Zerah. And Rabbi Zerah said to him, right, spoke to him and said, he received no answer, right? He was mute. And thereupon he said, you're a creature of the magicians. Actually, in Hebrew, or Aramaic rather, it says, you're one of the company, right? Like, you're one of those guys, right? It's in Hebrew and Aramaic. It says, go back to the dust, right? And Rabbi Chinia and Rabbi Shah said, also spent studying Sefer Yetzirah, by means of which they created a thoroughbred path, and they ate it. So in the Babylonian Talmud, again, the central work of rabbinical Judaism, there is no more important book in rabbinical Judaism, Babylonian Talmud. We have rabbis making people, making calves. So the distinction between what's magic and what's orthodox at this point has to be completely breaking down. Because I don't know about you, if I made a person, right, from dust and then sent them to you, you're going to be like, well, if it ain't magic, it'll do until magic gets here. Damn. Like, again, if making people ain't magic, I don't know what is. So what we have in Babylonian Talmud is the idea that somehow they're studying some book, some text, and creating people. Now again, the person's mute. There's no doubt about the fact that it's not a perfect person. They're mute, right? Which would have been thought of as a disability in the ancient world. Again, ancient ableism aside. What we have here is an image of creation by some kind of study. Further at ViralRabbi 55 days, we have the idea that Bezalel was chosen by God to be the architect of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Why? Because Bezalel, and I had the story not because my Hebrew name is Bezalel, but because it's a great story, but because Bezalel knew how to join the letters by which heaven and earth were created. So again, listen to that in the Babylonian Talmud at ViralRabbi 55 base, that Bezalel was chosen because he understood how to combine the letters by which heaven and earth were created. So already by the Talmud, we have the idea that the heavens and the earth were created, Olam, the cosmos were created by the combination of letters. And here again at Tractate Sanhedrin 67-65 base, we have the idea that you can create if you are righteous. If you are righteous. I'm not that righteous, thank God. Now, what's this text? Right, what's this text? Sefer Yetzirah is, without a doubt, the most enigmatic and important book of Jewish mysticism prior to the Kabbalah. There is no more important book prior to the rise of the Kabbalah in terms of Jewish mysticism than Sefer Yetzirah. I'll go on to say also later, Sefer Yetzirah is canonical. It's scripture now. In the Orthodox world, you can make arguments based on it. It is a kind of Jewish scripture. We're not like the Christians. The Christian canon is basically closed. The Muslim canon is definitely closed, right? The Jewish canon kind of is open. Stuff gets in, right? And from community to community, right? Things get in. And Sefer Yetzirah has certainly got in. I would consider it to be part of the Jewish canon, right along with the Bible and with the Babylonian Talmud and the Sefer Zohar, etc. What is it? What is the Sefer Yetzirah? It is a text produced sometime between 500 and 1000 of the Common Era. It's very brief. It's only about 2,000 words long. And it's a speculative text describing the method by which God created the cosmos, or the Olam. I'm going to use the word Olam because I prefer to use cosmos. I think it has connotations that are a little bit maybe too modern. And when I say Olam would include all of the physical world we now know of, described by the standard model of particle physics with 25 particles four forces, but the olam is a much bigger angle about what that would include angels and demons and all kinds of cool stuff. So, at any rate, the Sefer Yetzirah describes in very, very brief words, right? They're only about 2,000 words on an average recension. We can talk about recensions later. There are 3 or 4 different recensions of the Sefer Yetzirah that have come down to us, and there's a debate about how they came down to us. But what we have is a book describing how the world was created, attributed to none less than the patriarch Abraham. Why Abraham? Because there is a line in Genesis where it said Abraham made souls, right? That Abraham created souls. And the idea is that because Abraham could create souls, the only way he could have done that is if he had access to Sefer Yetzirah, and therefore that is proof for the traditional community, at least, that because Abraham could create souls, that he was also in command of the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, when was this book written down? The shorter answer is we have no idea. We just don't know. Sometime before 1000 of the Common Era, right? Now, the debate goes that sometime between the 2nd century and the 11th century, 800 years or something. We don't know. It's very difficult to figure out when this book was written down. I tend to agree with Zahi Weiss, who I'll have his name in his book in the recommended readings at the end of the lecture tonight. I tend to agree with Zahi Weiss that it was produced in the 7th century, maybe the 8th century, but it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this class. We're not going to get into the weeds about when it was written down. However, you may be interested in when it was published. Here on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the first edition of the Sefer Yetzirah published in Mantua, I think in 1562. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's in 1562 that was published in Mantua. But we have a first edition copy here. One of these copies, by the way, sells for about $60,000. So if you have $60,000 lying around, you want to buy me a gift, feel free to pick me up a copy of the Mantua edition of the Sefer Yetzirah. So, what is the Sefer Yetzirah? As I said, right, it's a book describing how God made the world. Now, what's also important about the Sefer Yetzirah is it is the first time we hear the word Sephirot. Now, this is a word that, for folks familiar with Kabbalah, this is a word you probably have heard before, right? Sephirot is one of these words that is a mainstay in the world of Kabbalah. Now, there are 2 things that are important about this word Sephirot. The first thing that's important about this word is that no one knows what it means, right? The root of the word, the shorish of the word is SFR, which in typical language Hebrew means to count, right? It just means to count. Now, if you want to make a noun out of that, right? Typically the noun would be mispar, and mispar actually does mean number. That's the Hebrew word for number. Mispar, misparim, right? It's a word for number. Well, the writer of this text doesn't go that route. They invent a new word that we've never seen before, and that new word they invent is Sephirot. Now, what they do is they take the word sphira and they add an ot to it, a feminine plural ending, and so we know it's in plural. What makes this word even more weird is that it's always accompanied in the Sefer Yetzirah with the term belima, the adjective belima. Now, the word belima only occurs once in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's a lapax legemenon, which means it only occurs once. And it's weird. Well, we know that beli, right, means without, and ma means what. And so it seems to mean without what. Now, what we have is a word made up, Sephirot, which kind of means number, and without what. So literally we can translate it as number without what. Now if you put that into the actual text, it makes no sense. Whatever the author's trying to do here, whatever they're trying to describe, a literal reading of it doesn't make sense. So what are the Sephirot Belima? What do we mean by the Sephirot the first time they appear in all of Jewish literature and all of the history of Jewish mysticism? Well, the one thing that we know from Sefer Yetzirah is they are not divine emanations. Now, I know that for folks who are familiar with some Kabbalah, right, we've seen the tree of life, right, with the dots, right, and God goes from Keter to Hokmar, Bina, right? 10 things. We'll get to that later, right? And that's the tree of life, and those are the Sephirot. Well, in the Sefer Yetzirah, it's not that. Whatever it is It's not that. They are not divine emanations. We'll get there tonight. In a minute. They're not that. What are they? No one knows. No one knows. The going guess, and I say guess, all right, because I really didn't mean guess. The going guess is that this is being influenced by Neo-Pythagoreanism, right? Neo-Pythagoreanism. Remember, Neo-Pythagoreanism, mouthful, is all about this number stuff, right? Remember, it's all about number being a reality. Well, one of the things we know about Pythagoreanism is that one of their sacred symbols was this thing called the tetrachus. You're seeing it on the screen here to the left. The idea of the tetrachus, right, is the idea that from one monad can give rise to two monads, right, plus, right? So these 2 plus 1 give rise to 3, and these 3 plus 1 give rise to 4. You add all this together, right, you get a base 10 counting system. And from a base 10 counting system, you have basically the origins of the number system, and then from there you have the origins of arithmetic, etc., etc. It's a geometric way of describing how numericality itself comes into existence. Now, I know that sounds really abstract. That's because it's really abstract, right? But we know this from the Pythagorean world, right? That they also thought there were 10 of these, right? There are 10 of these tetrachus, right? The tetrachus was a 10-node system. Well, guess what we know about the Sefer Belima? There are 10. And the text is really clear in Sefer Yetzirah. 10, not 9, 10, not 11. Exactly 10. I think, that what these Sephiroth mean are the basic structure of a decimal counting system. That what we have here is a decimal counting system. Why? Right? Because the symbol of 10 represents completeness in the Pythagorean system. And 2, the Sephiroth are also always described in relationship to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So for the Sefer Yetzirah, the world's created by 3 things. God, obviously, right? Using the 10 Sefirot and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, combine them together, creates everything else. So you have, well, you imagine it, right? What do you have? You have all the numbers, all the letters, combine all the numbers and letters together, and you get a universe. One can imagine that the 10 Sephiroth are the 10 countable things, the 10 system of counting, plus the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. They are the palette by which God painted the world into existence. So, in Sefer Yetzirah, they are not emanations of God. They are numerical structures, which when combined with the alphabet, are the substructure of reality. Language and math. Right? I think that's what's going on with Sefer Yetzirah. Now, if you go ask someone else, they'll give you another story. They'll give you another story. Right? I think that's what's going on. And I think that I base that upon, if you read other Neo-Pythagorean literature, they make the exact same argument. Right? So I think that's what's going on here. Now, what we get in Sefer Yetzirah is a description of several successive stages the universe went through, right? It's like we tell the story now, right? We have the Big Bang, the period of inflation, right? Then we have the world that we have it now, and eventually we'll have the black hole period and proton decay or whatever. Right? There are successive stages of the universe. Sefer Yetzirah also describes successive stages of the universe, how they come into being. Now, we can't get into the weeds of all that tonight, because we just don't have enough time to do all of that. We could spend an entire 8 weeks just on Sefer Yetzirah. But what's really important is that the mature part of the universe, right, the mature part of the Olam, is governed by what the Sefer Yetzirah calls Ketzivot. Ketzivot are limits, right? Limits, they're extremities. Again, that, by the way, limits, extremities, is Pythagorean language. They're translating this Pythagorean language, in my opinion, into Hebrew. And Ketzivot are these kind of limits. Now, what do those limits look like, right? Well, there are fundamentally 3 dimensions, right? 3 dimensions. Well, I say 3 dimensions, right? There's actually like 6 dimensions, but that's what they are, right? We have 2 dimensions of time, beginning and ending. We have 2 dimensions of space, right? Or 2 dimensions of, so 2 dimensions of time, 2 dimensions of space, above and below. And those include the 4 cardinal directions. So above and below, right, are the cardinal directions, and then in those they split off into the other directions. And then along with the 2 dimensions of time, beginning and ending, and the two dimensions of space. There are also two moral dimensions, right? Good and evil. This is a pretty interesting way of thinking about reality for this time period. And again, I think that someone with a background in physics, like Al, can appreciate, right? That they're already imagining reality as having dimensionality. That there are these mathematical ways of understanding the nature of reality that are describable abstractly as what we might call dimensions, what they call ketzivot, or limits, or extremities. This is followed by a very intense and very somewhat strange analysis, and yet still scientific, of the Hebrew alphabet itself, in which the writer of this text groups Hebrew letters into three groups based on the articulation of the points of the mouth. So when you make a mem sound, it's a m. It's using your lips, labials, right? When you make a dalet sound, it's a da, dentals. When you make an aleph sound, right, an ayin sound, right, those are gutturals, right? Those are articulated at different points. And so it's a kind of quasi-primitive, right? And I say primitive, I don't mean backwards, but I mean ancient form of linguistic analysis. Right, so they're analyzing language in terms of where these things get articulated in the face, in the mouth, and then finally, what happens is the letters are all set into a correspondence. And the way that the writer of Sefer Yetzirah imagines the cosmos, right, or reality, is it really has three layers. There's the olam, right, the whole big Megillah, right. There's time. Time is the movement of the olam, right? And there's the human being. And the human being is the center of it, right? Because they are something that exists and they are moving through time. And so the human being, the nefesh, the soul, right, is the nexus of the cosmos and time, right? And so they understand this. So what you get in the Sefer Yetzirah is a very very involved system in which letters are assigned to members of the zodiac, right? Shana, time, right? And then also letters are combined to describe the cosmos, right? Various parts of the cosmos. And they also describe various parts of your body. So your liver, your heart, your head, your eyes are set into correspondence with the various letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Because again, God spoke the world into being, and when God said ayin, right? Folks know this, right? The word ayin. Ayin is a Hebrew letter, and guess what ayin means? Eyes, right? God's not joshing around here, folks. When God said ayin, eyes came into existence. And what does sight see? Sees light, right? So we get this system of correspondence. So the Sefer Yetzirah is a very rigorous, scientific, philosophical, metaphysical analysis of how reality came to be. There have been several different periods of time. I just want to talk a little bit about those periods of time that worked themselves out, right? So we have a few different periods of time in the development of Sefer Yetzirah, right? The earliest period of time is when it developed. And the truth of the matter is we don't know anything about that time. We don't know exactly when and how it was developed. We think it was probably in kind of a Gnostic, theurgical, magical Greek, Syriac world, but it's everyone's guess. The first time we see the Sefer Yetzirah emerge is in philosophical scientific commentaries of the 10th century, right? So the 10th through the 12th century, the leading Jewish minds at the time spent time writing commentaries on Sefer Yetzirah. And they did it to try to show how this accurately describes the fundamental structure of reality. Now, again, when the Sadia Gaon, just to give an example, right? Sadia Gaon writes commentary on this. If the Sadia Gaon, the leading authority in all of the Jewish world at the time, feels the need to write a commentary on this, well, by God, that's scripture, right? If he takes it seriously, you bet your ass you're going to take it seriously, right? And it's not just him. It's Danilo, it's all kinds of people. Barzilai, lots of people. So we have these scientific commentaries of the 10th to the 12th century. And then the book becomes magicalized. Because if it describes how God made the world, and if righteous people can make their own worlds, then this might be a roadmap to making our own stuff. And so it enters into its magical period, specifically in Europe with the Fassi Ashkenaz in the 11th and 13th century, right? And then eventually it's synthesized into the Kabbalah in the 13th century, and eventually it makes its way into modernity. We'll get into a little bit more of this other more recent stuff in a bit. Now, of course, the Sefer Yetzirah is most heavily associated at the level of magic with the golem. I'm sure most folks here have heard of the golem. I've spent a lot of time talking about the golem. But the golem, of course, is an artificial humanoid made from clay animated by magical means, specifically by techniques found in the 2nd 12th century. And the commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah written by Eliezer Vermes, a German Ashkenazi rabbi, and he writes how to create a golem using various kinds of magical techniques, meditation techniques primarily, combining letters with vowels over and over and over again in a form of mystical meditation, and one can transform clay into a human being through these mystical meditations. And so the golem becomes this sort of artificial human. By the way, the word golem actually does appear in the Hebrew Bible once, I think, to describe an unformed fetus. It's actually sort of the word for fetus in the Hebrew Bible. It's an entity that's not quite human and not quite not human, somewhere in between. That's why, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, that if you kill someone, you're subject to the death penalty. But if in the middle of a fight, a man hits a woman who's pregnant and calls her to miscarry, he's not subject to the death penalty, because the thing inside her is a golem, not a person, right? So the rabbis are actually very clear about what's a person and what's not. For them, unborn people, right, unborn entities are golems, not people. That's why there's no death penalty case in that matter. Which is something I think is weird. I don't know why more fundamentalist Christians and people don't really. They're all about reading the Bible. We'll read the damn thing. Yeah, be about it. Don't talk about it. Be about it. Read the damn thing. So at any rate, the golem, right, is how this idea came about, right? Because if God can make things and I can make things, well, I can use speech to make things too, and the golem becomes the quintessential legend for this. Now, you probably heard the golem of Prague, just as a myth-busting thing to ruin your night. The golem of Prague was invented by a 19th century German writer, a non-Jewish German writer, and ascribed the whole idea to the Maharal of Prague. The Maharal of Prague never made a golem. There was no golem legends prior to the 19th century in Prague. Now, don't go shouting that very loudly if you go to Prague, because they'll throw you out of a window. That's Prague hospitality, because they make a lot of money on tourism on the whole golem thing. But the Maharal of Prague never made a golem. Never was interested in golems. If you read the Maharal of Prague's actual writings, he would have been very opposed to things like that. He was a pretty tenet to by the book kind of legalist, actually. So that entire legend was invented in some ways by whole cloth. Although the Golem movie is very important. What's also interesting about the Golem movie, I'll just mention here just briefly, is that the Golem movie as we have it is actually a prequel. It's a prequel. The original Golem movie and the sequel have both been lost. They're lost movies, sadly. So if you ever go see the Golem movie that we have is a prequel to a movie that's been lost. And the sequel, which we also know was made, has also been lost due to two of these movies that, a lot of, as you may know, a lot of film back in the day was printed on things like nitrocellulose or whatever, like really, really combustible film. And, even a spark could burn the whole thing down. And so a lot of these movies were lost. So if you ever see the Golem, just know that you're watching a prequel to a movie that was very popular that's been lost now. But the invention of an artificial humanoid. And further, the last thing I'll say about Sefer Yetzirah is that dozens of commentaries on this little book have been written in the centuries since it's been written. Sefer Yetzirah is probably the single most commented book after the Bible and the I should be careful what I say about that. There are dozens of commentaries, I will say that, on Sefer Yetzirah, and Standard Edition has at least 12 commentaries attached to it. And so the Sefer Yetzirah in the traditional Jewish world is a highly, highly, highly commented upon book. And it is, in fact, to this day, I think would say it is a canonical book of Jewish scripture. As we get into Europe, in the world of the Ashkenaz, and we're going to run a little over tonight, but I think it's okay. I won't try to go too far over. As we get into Europe, we get into the world of the Ashkenaz. We've been in the Middle East for a while, right? We've been in ancient Israel, ancient Palestine. We've been in the ancient Egypt. We've been in ancient Mesopotamia. The focus begins to shift beginning in the period of the 10th and 11th centuries. That has a lot to do with what's going on in the Middle East with things like the Mongol invasions and some kind of crackdowns, at least at some level, in terms of shift to traditional Jewish parts of the world in Europe, Ashkenaz being one of them. Now, people have these bizarre ideas that all of European Jews are descendants of Khazars that converted in the 9th century or something, and that all European Jews are not really Jews. There's all these kind of bizarre anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Jews have been in Europe for thousands of years, right? Because Jews have been traveling with the Romans the entire time, and wherever the Romans established trade places, Jews went. Like lots of people went. Greeks went, right? People forget, like, that, Massalia, Marseille, on the very south coast of France, was a Greek colony, right? Set there to do trade. So trade and movement of populations has happened all through the Roman world. People forget that one of the capitals of the Roman Empire was Trier in Germany, right? That blows people's mind, but Constantine the Great was born in Trier, in what is now Germany, the birthplace of Karl Marx, of all people. So Jews have been in Europe for centuries. Now, what goes online, right, is that beginning in this period, right, Jews come to the forefront of learning and other kinds of things, not just trade. And in Ashkenaz, around the turn of the millennium, maybe a couple hundred years after the turn of the millennium of 1000 Common Era, we have a very weird esoteric theology developed that is called the unique cherub circle. And the unique cherub circle introduced the idea that God and the world can't be directly connected. Why? Well, it's simple philosophy. If God is infinite and the world is finite, then the distance between the infinite and the finite is always going to be infinite. That's a theological problem. So what do? You need something to link the world. You need a bridge, something that's quasi-finite and something that's kind of finite, like quasi-infinite. And what they introduced was the idea of ha'atzalah, right? Ha'atzalah, that God flows out of God's self, and somehow the flowing out of God's self bridges the gap between the infinite God and the finite world. And the thing that bridges the gap for this group of people was a thing called the unique cherub, right? The cherub is a kind of angel, as you probably know. And this unique cherub bore the glory of God. That God's glory had a hidden inner glory, right? Right? It's like imagine the inside of the sun, right? The inside of the sun is full of like energy and intensity, but we never see it. What do we see of the sun? We see the outside layer, right? We see the outer glory. And the outer glory, right, of God, the outer kavod, flows out and becomes a kind of special angel, a unique cherub. And that special angel is an atzalah, is an emanation of flowing out of God, right? And that bridges the gap between the infinite and the finite with the unique cherub in the middle. Now, we don't know much about this group, right? This is a very strange group of rabbis there in Ashkenaz, in Germany, and we're still doing research about them. But it seems like they've been introduced to the idea of Neoplatonism. And we'll talk about Neoplatonism next time. All right, we'll talk about it at length. Now, what ends up happening is that infused with this idea of Ha'atzalah, of emanation, the Sefer Yetzirah gets fused to it. So the idea is, well, it can't just be one thing, right? Maybe it's 10. Maybe there are 10 things standing between the infinite, utter transcendent God and us. And maybe between those things, there are 10 things. Because Sefer Yetzirah says there are 10. 10 Sephirot Belimah, right? So maybe the ladder has 10 rungs. Maybe the ladder has 10 rungs. And that idea of the ladder having 10 rungs is taken up in the first Kabbalistic text in history, the Sefer Bahir. This is from the first text of Kabbalah. If you want to start studying Kabbalah, this is the text to start with, the Sefer Bahir. This is the first printed version you see here on the left-hand side. This is a midrash, right? Midrashim are texts in which the Bible is used as a stepping stone, or a diving board, if better, right, to riff, right? Like folks here like jazz, right? If you like jazz, right? One of the things that go to a jazz show, right? Coltrane might start a riff, right? And then Monk might pick up, right? The drums. And then someone else is going to pick up, right? And then they're going to riff. And they're going to riff, and they're going to riff, and a riff. Variation on a theme, right? If you want to think about what Midrash is Jewish jazz. It's taking a riff and going with it, right? Commenting on it, legends, weird stuff, strange ideas, right? Don't read this, read that. Turn the letters around backwards, read them that way, right? It's riffing, right? It's improvisation on these ideas. Midrash is Jewish jazz, right? So what we get in the Sefer Bahir is a work of Jewish jazz, Midrash. It's very popular in the Middle Ages, right? But this Midrash is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is because it's ascribed to a first century Jewish scholar, Nechunya ben Akana. Now, Nechunya ben Akana didn't write this, but it's ascribed to him to kind of give it a little gravitas. Further, what's also really important about this is it's very clear that whoever wrote this is doing some really, really interesting theological, philosophical mysticism. They're riffing on this material, on the Bible, in a way we've never seen before. Now, did they make it all up? Were they part of a larger tradition? Was there a community of people doing this? This is just the one work that survived? We don't know, right? But what we do know is this text introduces the core concepts that become the foundation for the Kabbalah as we know it. Now, these midrashim inside of, there are 200 of these inside of the Sefer Bahir, they are not united in any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the story goes right that the writer must have written them all down, and then the story is that they threw them into the air, and ever how they landed, that's how they edited together. The editing seems random, right? Now, there are passages that do seem contiguous, and then they kind of titter off into seemingly random commentaries. But there are a couple things that are very crucially important about Sefer Bahir. The first thing that's really crucially important is Sefer Bahir combines Sefer Yetzirah in the unique cherub circle. The Sefer Bahir says there are emanations of God, right? There's again, have you ever folks ever like boiled milk, right? Or like better yet, have you ever seen like go to a wedding where someone's pouring champagne over like one glass, and one glass sits on like two glasses, and two glasses sit on four glasses, right? They're pouring the champagne flows down all the glasses. Well, imagine like pouring the champagne, the bottle never got empty, right? That's what the Sephirot are. It's God pouring God's self out, but because God is infinite, God never becomes empty, and the world becomes full, right? That's what the emanations are. So Sefer Bahir does two really important things in this respect. It combines the 10 Sephirot of the Sefer Yetzirah with the idea of emanations, and it says, yes, God emanated in 10 forms, distinct forms. There are 10 distinct emanations, and it discusses them at length. Now, Kabbalah, as you probably know it, as everyone knows it, if there is nothing else that makes Kabbalah Kabbalah, it's that. There are 10 emanations. They relate to each other. They are various aspects of God. God's mercy, God's judgment, God's glory, God's victory, God's beauty. Right? That's a core component of Kabbalah. We'll start getting into that stuff next time. Right? So that's the one thing, very important thing that Sefer Bahir does. It combines those two ideas into one system for the first time. Secondly, right, what Sefer Bahir does is it introduces the idea that God has a feminine form, the Shekhinah, right? Now, the idea of the Shekhinah goes all the way back to the Talmud, right? But never does God have a feminine form. It's just that the word Shekhinah is feminine grammar-wise. But in the Bahir, the Shekhinah is described as a lady, almost always in the same kind of language being used to describe other women in the medieval period. She's actually described as a matronita, right? It's a Latin term that becomes an important term in medieval court legal work. So God's presence in the world becomes feminized. Again, if you know nothing else about Kabbalah, you know that the Shekhinah is the feminine presence of God in the world. Lecha Dodi. Every time you've ever been to a Kabbalah Shabbat service, you've sung Lecha Dodi. It's all about welcoming the Shabbat bride, the Shabbos bride, the Shabbat bride, who is God's feminine form. This idea appears for the first time in the Sefer Bahir. Right? And again, the language here is full of courtly language. We think this text is being written sometime in the early Middle Ages. Although there are people like Ronit who actually says it may be Meroz, who says it may be written in Babylon. It's really hard for me to tell. Frankly, those folks are such brilliant scholars that I'm just going to defer to their ingenuity. What's also important about the descriptions of the Shekhinah in the Sefer Bahir is that she's almost always described in these really weird terms as an exile, that she came from the land of light, or that she's a princess from a faraway land. And scholars, at least of an earlier generation, and I think even some scholars now, and maybe even me, detect that in Gnostic literature, we can talk maybe a little bit more about Gnostic literature in the Q&A afterwards. There's an idea in Gnostic literature, this is a form of heterodox religion that existed back in the ancient classical world, where there's the incarnation of Sophia, of wisdom, and she makes a mistake. And she creates this hideous ruler god who creates our physical world, and our physical world is a trap, right? But she's the incarnation of light and brilliance and wisdom, right? And she's always described as being from another world, right? And some people think, right, so especially in earlier generation of scholarship, maybe even some folks now, think that the Sefer Bahir may continue forth a tradition or drag into the Middle Ages some Gnostic ideas. We're going to talk more about those later if folks are interested in those Gnostic ideas. But there seems to be some kind of quasi-Gnostic character to the Shekhinah as she appears in the Sefer Bahir. The last couple things I'll say about the Sefer Bahir as we wrap up for the night is, one, the Sefer Bahir describes divine power as a kind of tree, right? As a kind of fullness. Now, that tree language is going to be obviously very important, because if you've ever studied Kabbalah, the one thing you'll know is that the Sephirot are often arrayed in what's called the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, and that tree language, right? The God is a kind of divine tree, also appears in Sefer Bahir, and it describes God as having roots and limbs and blood, flowers, and leaves and things. There's kind of a fullness to God, which also seems to maybe have its origins in very ancient Gnostic schools of thought. Also, and this will be important as we get later on into Kabbalah proper, is that for the Sefer Bahir, evil seems to have a life of its own. Now, in traditional Judaism and in traditional Christianity, evil is thought of as a privation, right? Augustine, I'll just give an example from the Christian tradition, right? Augustine says that evil isn't a thing in itself, right? Evil is a lack of something. It's a lack of God's grace. In the same way that heat is a thing, but cold isn't. Darkness is not a thing. Light is. Darkness is just a term we use for the absence of light. Cold is just the term we use for the absence of heat. Evil is just a term we use for the absence of God. Well, ancient Gnostics believed that evil was very real. It had its own existence. And there are sections in the Sefer Bahir that say, yeah, evil existed on its own. It was out there all along. God kind of tamed it, but not quite. And what we'll see, and when we get into Proto-Kabbalah next time, is that evil is going to be one of the overwhelmingly interesting things on the part of the Kabbalists. Where did evil come from? Because, as you might imagine, Jews living in Europe in the 13th century are going to deal with a lot of evil. And they're going to be very interested in where evil comes from. And the image that the traditional Kabbalists will use is the very image you're seeing here on the left. That evil is the sparks thrown off the anvil as God created the world. Right? Just as when you create a knife, you have to pound the steel. As you pound the steel, it throws off dross. Well, when God made the world, it threw off dross. And that dross, for the early Kabbalists, is evil. And it's always been here. It's always been here. And that image of the blacksmith hammering at the anvil will be an image we'll see repeatedly when we get into Kabbalah. Well, folks, we are there. We have now crossed the threshold from the Merkabah Hechalot world. We are now into the world of what we might call the Proto-Kabbalah. Now, what I want to just reinforce as we wrap up for the night is that Kabbalah was not born all at once. As you can see, these ideas are developing. We have the Sephirot from the Sefer Yetzirah. We have the emanation sequence from the unique cherub circle. We have it synthesized by the Sefer Bahir. We're going to see that later texts further synthesize ideas from the Sefer Bahir. Kabbalah is a development. It's a development. So it's really important to understand that when people talk about the Kabbalah, they're not quite right. What we should talk about is Kabbalistic development and then schools of Kabbalah. Right? Now we'll see. We'll get into this later on as we get into Kabbalah. We'll see this a lot more clearly. Well, finally, I just want to point to some additional reading. I know that folks love to do. Folks like to get into this stuff, and I know that literature on the Kabbalah can be a mire, right? It can either be really, really technically sophisticated, and you have to learn to read 15 languages to figure this stuff out, or it can be like a lot of hooey stuff that people just make up out of their mind. But these texts are all really solid. I mentioned earlier, right, that Zahi Weiss, I think, has written, for me, one of the best arguments for the early history and development of the Kabbalah. So if you really want to get into the weeds of how Kabbalah, about Sefer Yetzirah, rather, how Sefer Yetzirah developed, I think Zahi Weiss has a really great argument, in my opinion. The Peter Heyman text is the standard edition now, critical edition of the Kabbalah. You're going to need ILL that one. It costs like $800. So you're not going to get it from a university library, but it is the standard analysis of the Sefer Yetzirah. Aria Kaplan is the standard one you get on Amazon. It's okay. He analyzes the Sefer Yetzirah from a Lurianic Kabbalistic perspective, which isn't bad or anything, but I think it distorts the text in a way that I find to be confusing, especially people who've never encountered the text before. In the standard religious version of the Sefer Yetzirah, the best religious version, if you want to read a religious version with a bunch of commentaries, is the Sefer Yetzirah HaShalem, that's published by Harav Moshe Suriel. You can get that. I can give folks a link if you want to buy that, but you'll need to be able to read Hebrew and stuff for that one. It's only in Hebrew. So if you want a copy of that one, I can send you a link to it if you like. And for Sefer Bahir, Joseph Don has a really great book on both the early Kabbalah and the unique cherub circle. That unique cherub circle book also is an IOL. It's very expensive. And we'll get to the books of contemplation here next week. And also, Aria Kaplan has a nice version of the Sefer Bahir. That, again, comes with the same caveats, right? He's a Lurianic Kabbalist, and he brings a specific Lurianic interpretation to the text that, again, it can be confusing. I'm not opposed to Kabbalists doing Kabbalah. I mean, Kabbalists should do Kabbalah. That's their bag. But I think that often when beginner people pick it up, it's like, oh, this is what it means. I'm like, yeah, not really. It's not quite that. It's more complicated than that. So again, I don't want to fault the Kabbalist for being a Kabbalist, but it's not academic, right? It's not an academic text. But it is easily accessible and widely available online. Well, folks, next week we turn to the early Kabbalah. We're going to be looking at some developments in southern France and Spain. We're going to be looking at how the earliest strata of Kabbalah developed. And then after that, we turn to the most monumental text in all of Jewish mystical history, and that's going to be the Sefer Zohar, right? The Book of Illumination. My child is named Zohar. If you want to get an idea about how important this book is to me and mine, I got a kid named Zohar. So I take it pretty seriously, and so we'll get to the Sefer Zohar after, the time after next. But next time we'll be dealing with philosophical, mystical developments in the earliest stages of Kabbalah in Europe, in the very earliest stages of Kabbalah at all. So we'll turn to the early Proto-Kabbalah next time. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
You fucking go fuck yourself.